Hello, my name is Marcus Lynn. Today we'll be discussing the immorality of child pageantry and my stance that I believe that children should be banned from participating in beauty pageants. It's the unrealistic beauty standards, the hypersexuality, and exploitative nature of child beauty pageants that are detrimental to a child's development, and it causes long-term psychological scarring because of these unjust ideologies that are being placed on these children. In today's presentation, we'll discuss the origin of child pageantry, mainstream media normalizing the exploitation of children, the ideology of beauty determining self-worth, parenthood dictatorship, the importance of communication with children and the freedom of their youth, and parents using children to fulfill a sense of achievement. In the next slide, we'll begin by talking about the history. It all began with showman P.T. Barnum, who began to host beautiful baby contests in the early 1850s, where they began to normalize this exploitation of children based on their appearance and their performance of adult-like behaviors. This form of child pageantry began to spread like wildfire by the turn of the century, where small, localized events that were once being held became larger and more organized pageants and parades, most notably being the one in Coney Island called the Baby Parade, where participation swelled to over 500,000 spectators watching these children being paraded across a stage. In our next slide, this brings us to mainstream media, which is continuing to glorify and popularize child beauty pageants and undermining the severity of child exploitation. Today, we see television shows such as Toddlers and Tiaras and Painted Babies and Here Comes Honey Boo Boo, who have attempted to normalize this behavior and show these children depicted in revealing clothing and perpetuating a problematic sense of normalcy for children. These children, even though they're on the stage and they're on TV, they're still vulnerable and voiceless, and they're fragile, and they're told not to speak because it'll break their illusion that they are not children. And growing up, I remember seeing these series on television and cringing at the sight of them as children are being objectified and judged for something that they have no control over and shouldn't have to worry about having control over. I was bullied because of my appearance as a child, and it was devastating to me. And it's only just a mere fraction of what these young girls and young boys have to endure by being judged by not only a panel of judges, but the entire world. Which brings us to our next slide, where we see that it's no longer just a physical issue, but now we're getting to a mental problem with these pageants, where this an ideology of your self-worth being reliant on your personal appearances is reverberating in these children and into their adult life in the form of mental illness, where some of them are struggling with anxiety and are overstressed and deal with body shaming and body dysmorphia and other eating disorders as a result of this unrealistic sense of beauty and emphasis on physical perfection. These kids are being put in makeup and wigs and fake teeth, and some are even undergoing plastic surgery to distort their image and cover up imperfection they didn't know that they had. These judges are adults, and they're pushing this narrative on these kids and obscuring the natural beauty and personal uniqueness that makes these kids who they are. And it's devastating, especially in this crucial time during their development. And when we look at the parents and parenthood in our next slide, we see that is it parenthood or is it dictatorship? As a parent, you're supposed to be authoritarian, but you're also supposed to be that guide, and there should be careful consideration should be made to determine if what is going on is in the child's best interest or if it's just going against their wishes. Parents should create that space where children should be able to communicate and set boundaries of what they do and do not want. And they should be comfortable expressing themselves when they are uncomfortable. Forcing these children to do something that only makes the adult happy at the child's expense is not parenting. In my childhood, I was forced to compete in speech competitions, and no matter how well I did, I was still berated for the things that I didn't do. And it was devastating to hear these things, even though it was something that I didn't want to do in the first place. I still wasn't acknowledged for my triumphs. And even when I protested and said I did not want to participate, I was often ignored. And it was frustrating and disappointing to know that my wants and my needs were not being taken into account. Which brings us to our next slide, where we see that it is important for the kids to enjoy that small window that they have to be a child and when they have the rest of their lives to be an adult. These early years in their childhood set the basis for their intelligence, for their personality, their social behaviors, and even their capacity to learn and nurture themselves once they become an adult. The self-discovery during this period is essential, and it shouldn't be tainted by a panel of judges, a panel of strangers, and the world telling them who they should and shouldn't be. These superior expectations can have the opposite effect on these kids, such as low ambition and feeling of inadequacy. And it's just these unattainable standards are being ingrained, and it's inhibiting their own creativity because they're conforming instead of growing. A childhood should be worryless and it should be filled with the feeling of an overabundance of opportunities and not responsibilities. In our next slide, we start to look at the mentality of these adults. They're subjecting these children to this mental strain, and it can be attributed to this achievement by proxy distortion, which urges them to see beyond their child's limitations and their wants. And these adults are driven primarily by social and financial gain earned by their child's accomplishments, regardless of the risk involved for the child. And sometimes these risky behaviors can even end up being abuse if the child isn't performing and making the accomplishments that the parent wants. These parents should be parenting and not managing. I personally have seen this phenomenon happen through my stepsister, who was in these pageants, and I watched as her mother chastised her for poor performance and pushed her against her will to do these things. And I watched her cry and moan and watched as her child was taken away from her, and watched her be depressed from not being able to be her true self. And as disheartening as it was for me, I could only imagine how it felt for her. Through this presentation, in our next slide, we see that we discuss the beauty pageant circuit and how extremely damaging it is to children that are subjected to it, how it's perpetuated through the mainstream media. It promotes a faulty ideology that negatively affects these children, provides a space for a child's well-being to not be placed at the forefront. It prevents self-discovery in these children and allows parents to live vicariously through these children at their expense. And that is why I believe that beauty pageants should ban participation of children. My final thought is that every parent has that responsibility to protect their child, but society must also take accountability for normalizing these behaviors that are having this adverse effect on these children. We must fight for our children so that they do not have to fight for themselves. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope that you were able to take something away from this presentation.